Well, good morning, everyone. If you're on the West Coast or Mountain or Central, and good afternoon if you're here on the East Coast. Today we are going to be working on the Alteryx Designer, and we're going to be looking specifically at data parsing or cleaning up data that we get. Now, in today's webinar, we are not going to spend a lot of time in PowerPoint, but I just want to get us started here and remind you uh, that my name is Robert Frere, and I'm one of the enablement team members. And one of the things I do a lot is enablement training, so that if your organization has a need for a number of people to get trained in specific areas in Alteryx Designer, I would be one of the people that may be assigned to your team to accomplish that. We are Data Meaning. We are one of the Alteryx's premier partners. And so Alteryx will partner with us to help fulfill their engagements with various customers across the country. And so today is the third of our webinars. And I want to remind you that after the webinar is over, we will be sending out to you the recording of this session so that you can review that. And also want to let you know that if you have any technical questions, we're going to be answering those through the QA panelist mechanism here in the webinar. So if you have a question about anything we're covering, uh, you can ask in the Q&A, and one of our panelists will go ahead and answer that for you. And also at the end, if we have some time, if there are some questions left over, we'll be able to take on those as well. All right, so make sure we know where we are. This is again the third of five webinar series on Designer. We've had the introduction to Designer and an overview of the environment. Last week we did data blending, or being able to combine different data sets together in a meaningful business fashion um, for further evaluation and further enhancement within Alteryx. And today we're talking about cleansing our data sets or data parsing. How do we take data files that may not be in an ideal format? How can we take those, clean them up to allow us to do our analysis in a good order? So that's the what we're going to be covering today. The agenda. We've got just this introduction here. I think I've got one more slide here, and then then we're going to be jumping right into the use case, where today we're going to be looking at these tools here. I won't read them all to you. You guys can read from the screen here. But as we approach each of these tools, we're going to go a little bit in depth on each of the tools, as well as implementing them to create a workflow where we take a file that has some empty columns, some empty rows, some mixed up data, and setting it so that we have our text in our text columns, our numbers in our number columns, and that everything is straightforward for us to be able to conduct our analysis. And then finally, here at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. All right, so with no further ado, I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint, and we're going to look at our file that we're going to be dealing with. So a lot of times for many businesses, you get data coming in through Excel. Excel is certainly a very common format. Now you may get this in other formats as well, and Alteryx can handle a wide variety of data formats. But today I'm going to be just talking specifically about this Excel file and how we would take it and make it more the format more conducive to data analytic. So when we look at our file here, one thing we notice jumps out to me right away is that that we have some empty columns here in the middle, right? So if I look down, I see that throughout my data sets here, I don't have any data in these columns. So that's an interesting thing. I probably don't need those columns. Also, I have a date on the upper left-hand corner of my spreadsheet, but I don't have I don't need any more data from those different columns. So that's another thing that I might want to clean up. Also, I want to notice you to notice here that I've got this our fund information, but I've got this category of taxable information, but here is in the same column as we have actual fund information. So when we look at this, then it makes sense that we would want to take this taxable category or this fund category and create a new column for it as opposed to interspersing it with our numeric columns. So those are the different things that we're going to be looking at today. So the first thing that we're going to do then is we're going to take care of the top aspect of this, which is getting rid of these top two rows so that we can pull in our data into Alteryx Designer. All right, so here's again is the data that I have brought this data into the Alteryx Designer, and now we're going to look at the first of the tools, which we're going to get rid of those top two rows. Now, one of the things about Alteryx Designer, as we've stressed over the last couple of weeks, is there are a wide array of tools. There are more than 200 tools available within the Alteryx Designer. So one of the things that when we're getting started with the tool, we want to focus on and learn more about how to use particular tools. In this case, we're going to look at the sample tool, because the sample tool is going to help us in our process of our workflow. So I'm grabbing the sample tool from the preparation palette. I'm bringing it down onto my canvas and I'm dropping it onto the canvas here. Now, when I do that, I'll look over here on the left into my configuration window, and I see some different configuration options, and also at the bottom some group by information down here at the bottom. So what is this sample tool all about? So let's look over here on this other tab I have, and let's take a quick look at the sample tool. So the sample tool then gives us several options. One of the things is it tells us we can choose the first or select the first n rows. Now, when we look at that as an option, the n here, it's important for us to know, is defined down here where it says n equals. So you can read this option here as saying the first 10 rows are what I'm going to include in my data set. If I choose this option, I'm saying the last 10 rows are going to be included. So however many rows I have in my initial data set, if I choose the first n rows and I run my workflow, you'll see that I started out with 90 rows in my data set. Now, but after my sample tool, I have only 10 rows remaining. And that's because I said I wanted the first 10 rows of my data set. All right, so the second option would be the last 10 rows. So again, that's just taking it from the bottom. Now that actually brings up something that I'll talk about in passing here, which is that uh, when Alteryx Designer, when you process a data file, especially in an Excel file, what you can think of it as Alteryx is going to start its processing on row 1 of your data set, and then it's going to process row 1 and then 2 and then 3, etc., all the way down. So the order that you're looking at is important when you bring it into Alteryx. So that's how we get this concept of the first n rows. So the top of our Excel file or the top of our data file, if you brought in data from a database, the first 10 rows of data, that's what's going to be the ones that are at the top of your data set. The last ones are going to be at the bottom of your data set. And then for our specific case here, we're going to be looking at this that says skip the first n rows. So if you say skip the first n rows, what that's going to do in this case is it's going to take the first 10 rows of my data set, it's going to skip those, and it's going to start the pulling in of the data with row 11. All right, so in our case, when we have our data set, when let me look at that spreadsheet again. When we're looking at our data set, we want to get rid of these first, excuse me, there, the first two rows. So in order to do that, then in Alteryx is we will look at the configuration window. We're going to come down here to the third option, which is the skip the first n rows. And then for n, I want to put in the number 2. All right. And then what I always like to do when I'm building a workflow is I always put a browse tool at the end, just so that I can make sure I can see all my data that's going on. So when I run this workflow, you'll see that I started out with 45 rows in my data set, but then only 43 made it through our sample tool. So if I click on the sample tool and I can look at the input anchor, I'll see that I have those 2 rows that give me the date of this report and a blank row altogether. And then on the output, so after the sample tool is run, then I see that the top line in my data set is now what looks like my column headers that I'm going to have. All right, so our sample tool did exactly what we were hoping for, and now we're going to move to the second step. Now the second step is, right, now that when we get rid of these 2 rows, which we've done right here, these 2 rows, and I can just delete those rows. Right now we have it here. Now, this is one difference I want to point out between specifically Excel and Alteryx is in Excel, your column headers are in the row 1 of your data set most often. Now, sometimes when you have it formatted nicely, it'll be like we had here, it'll be down a couple of rows. But in this case, when we get rid of those opening 2 rows, our columns are the first row of our data in essence. But in Alteryx Designer, it's a different concept, because in Alteryx Designer, you have actual column headers. So in this case, I have F2, F3, F4, F5, etc. And then I have my columns that are coming from my incoming data file. So now the next step that I want to accomplish then is I want to make fund the column header, because fund isn't my actual information. These are my actual funds. But I want to be able to make this column name fund, this column name 1 day, this column name 1 month, etc. So there's a particular tool that we're going to look at here, which is the dynamic rename tool. So if you don't know where it is, you can type in dynamic in the search mechanism, and here you'll find dynamic rename tool. So I'm going to grab that, I'm going to bring it down, and I'm going to set it right here inside my in my workflow between my sample tool and my browse tool. So when I set this down here, then I'm going to look at the options in here. So let me show us a little bit of detail about this dynamic rename tool. So in the dynamic rename tool, what it is you take your data set, and the dynamic rename tool works on these column headers. That's what it's going to be changing. So in this case, I have the first dynamic rename tool set up here. And what I'm doing is I'm choosing the option. The fourth option from the top is take a field name from the first row of data. All right. Because Alteryx works a lot with Excel, it knows that a common mechanism within Excel is to have the column names as the first row. So that's a built-in option for our dynamic rename. So if I look at my input, actually, let me run this. If I look at my input into this rename tool, we'll see that I have field 2, 3, 4, etc. And then right here, I have customer ID, first name, last name. Now, when I run this tool and I look at the output, it is now moved what used to be the first row of data up into the column header names. So that is one of the options for using the dynamic rename, and it's going to be the option that we use for our example. But I did want to show you another way of using this dynamic rename tool, which is you can also use it in a formula mode. So in the formula mode, what it's going to do is you're going to create a formula down here at the bottom. And in this case, what it's going to do is it's going to look for if my current field has the name zip in it, then it's going to change the name of that column header to be zip underscore code. So if we take a quick look at our data set here, we'll see that uh, down here we have, well, let me look at it beforehand. We had the zip and zip underscore or -4 as two column names. So when we run it with this formula here, it changes those two columns to have underscore code as part of the name of those columns. It didn't add underscore code to the rest of the columns, just to the columns that had the zip in the title. So that's what this formula does. And it's another way, powerful way of using the dynamic rename tool. All right. So for our option, what we're going to do here is we're going to click on our dynamic rename. We're going to not use a formula. We're going to use the take the field names from the first row of data. So I'm setting that here. Now, in this box here, you're saying what columns do you want it to take the data from? So I'm going to go ahead and say all the columns, and it'll warn me if there's any missing fields, and then I'll run my workflow again. And now you can see I went from 43 rows to 42 rows because that first row of data, when I click back on here, that first row of data that where it says latest, fun, 1 day, 1 month, 3 months is now actually the column headers instead of the first row of data. All right, so that's good. Now we've got 2 steps down. So returning back to our Excel, we've gotten rid of the first 2 columns. Now, or first 2 rows, sorry, and we've put our column headers in as actual column header names. Now, when we look back at our data, what's the next step that we want to face? Well, when I look here, these look to be columns that are null. And I want to make sure if they are null, I want to go ahead and get rid of those columns because they're wasted space. All right, so that's what we're going to do next here in Alteryx Designer. Now, this is one of the places where the browse tool will actually help you out a lot, because if we click on the browse tool, we can click on this field that I think is all null. Now, actually, if I just hover over here, I see that it says it's 100% null. Now, of course, this data file has only got 42 records in it. You could visually look at each of the rows and see that they're null. But what about when you've got 200,000 rows or 1,000,000 rows? To try to do that visually is very problematic. But in this case, using these tools, you can highlight and you can see that this is 100% null. I've got this column selected, and I can run it here, and I can tell that these are 100% null. I can look down here and see that in this case, all of my values are nulls. So I see that all 42 rows have a value of null. So I can get rid of these three columns without adversely affecting the rest of my data. All right, so how do I go about getting rid of columns in my data set? Well, I come up here and I'm going to grab my select tool and I'm going to bring it down and be able to then when I look at the select tool, I can come over here to my configuration window and I can come here and I can say, aha, field 15, I don't want that, so I'm going to uncheck it. I don't want field 15.2, unchecking that one, and I don't want this one, field 15.3. So I uncheck that. So this embedded select here gives you the ability to do that for our tools. Also, if you wanted to, you could change the data types of our columns to be numeric instead of string, or vice versa, however you want to deal with that. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename one of my columns. My first column has a long column name to it. I'm just going to type in here the latest is going to be the extent of that column name. So now you can rename the columns, you can select which columns you want to include, and you can even reorder the columns by selecting a column and moving it up or back. You can change the order of your column in your data set. All right, so I'm going to leave it like this. I'm going to run. And now when I look at my output here, I see now that I've got my column headers. I've got my those three columns that were all nulls are now gone from the middle of this, of my use case or my workflow here. And now I can go back and let's look and see what's the next step from our Excel file. So now we have gotten rid of our empty columns, and now what we want to tackle is this values over here where we have our fund category information in the same column as our actual latest fund values here. So these are numeric, these are text. We don't want to have numeric and text in the same column. So how would I do change this in Excel? Well, in Excel, what I would do is I would create a formula, and if I click on this column, I created this formula before the webinar started, so I'll just show you what it is here. Is I have an if statement, and then the first thing I'm going to look at is if is blank B2. So I'm going to look at this column, this fund cell here, and if this cell is doesn't have a value in it or is blank, then I want to take the value for A2 and I want to populate my new column with that value. Now this is a key part to what I'm going to show you here in a minute. The next part though says if B2 is not blank, then I want you to actually go up one row and look at the value above it. All right, so in our case, when we do this and we hit return here, it says taxable. Now if I copy this and down to the rest of my data set that I have here, and I hit enter, what you'll see is that it took this name here, taxable, and it applied it to every one of the funds until the next uh, row that had a blank in the fund category here. And then when it saw that, it changed the name to the taxable ZXY. All right, so then it did that all the way down to the bottom of our data set. All right, so now we want to do that exact same thing in Alteryx Designer. So if I come back here to my Alteryx Designer and I want to grab a new tool, which is called my multi-row formula tool. Now, the reason that it's being multi-row is an important concept. So let me show you a little bit of the detail of this one, and then I will speak more as to why we're using the multi-row formula tool. All right. So in the multi-row formula tool, when you set this, you have the at the top of the tool, you've got a couple of options. You can update an existing field, or you can create a new field. So in this case, if I was updating an existing field, and I want to say here, if the year is null, then I want to look at the above row and get the year out of that. Else, I want to leave it as it is. All right. So what does my data look like in a before and after in this case? So in before this tool was executed, you'll see that I had the year 2012 here, and then I had a bunch of nulls all the way down to 2013. Now, after this tool was run, now it filled in the 2012s until it got to 2013. Then it filled it in with 2013, etc., all the way down. All right, so that's how the tool works. Now, the key concept for the multi-row formula tool is this. When Alteryx is executing a formula, if you use just the regular formula tool, it's only going to look at the current row as the row that it will process. But the multi-row formula tool allows you to look to the previous row or to the subsequent row. So you can look ahead of you or behind you in your processing. All right, now if you're looking at row 1 of your data set, if you try to get something from above or the previous row, that's row 0, or there's not going to be any value there. But this multi-row tool allows you to go back one row and do that, because what happens here is when you get to the second row, in our case, it's saying when the row -1, if the null year is null, then look at row -1. Well, in this case, the year is null here, so it's going to actually look up to the row above it, 2012, and it's going to fill in this column with that value. All right, so that's how the multi-row formula tool works. We're going to then use it in the same way for ours, except for instead of updating an existing field, we're going to actually create a new field. So when we create a new field here, I'm going to call this one fund category. All right, and then I have to make sure what type it is, because fund category is going to have those words taxable or XYZ, etc. This is actually a string. So I'm going to make this one a V string, and the size is very important, because if I left it as a size 4, it would only give me 4 digits or 4 characters in my string. So in this case, I'm going to make this a 35 size for my fund category. All right, then this next option, number of rows, you are designating how many rows behind or how many rows ahead do you want to look. In our case, we only want to look one row up, so that we'll be fine. Now, in this case, you also have the group by option, but in our case, we don't want to group by, because we want this formula to apply to everything the way that it currently exists in our table. We don't want to go ahead and try to create a new a new grouping, because if we did that, it would throw off the order of our columns. All right, so now then I'm going to create my formula here. And so what I'm going to do here is just like I did in Excel. It's going to be just a little bit different. So in this case, I'm going to type in if. So there's if statements are available within Alteryx. And now there isn't an is blank function within Alteryx, but there is something much like it, which is empty. So I'm going to say if is empty, and then what column do I want to look at? I want to look at that fund column. So I'm going to grab that fund value and put it in here. So if the fund column is empty, then I want to take my value from my column that's right up here, which is the latest column. All right. Now, but what about if it's not empty? If it's not empty, and this is the point at where we're going to use something that's specific to the multi-row formula tool, I want to look at this same column, this fund category column, from the row above me. So I'm going to go to row -1. I'm going to look at my fund category column, and I'm going to put that in there so that if it actually has a fund name, I know I'm in the same category as the previous row. So that's my else. And then to finish off the syntax of the if statement, I'm going to type in end if. All right, so this formula right here is the Alteryx equivalent of this formula right here, where we had the if is blank A2 else L1. That's the same thing as if is empty the fund column, then latest else the row above fund category value. So those two are equivalent. I'm going to then run my workflow, and when I see here, then what I see is now I have this new column called fund category, and in it, it is populated the fund category all the way down to where the fund category changes, and then we see that it correctly grabs each of our types here and shows us our values for each of our fund categories. All right, so we made that next step forward. Now, if we go back to our Excel file, now our problem is we put the fund category out here. I could type in fund category over here. But my problem still is that I still have this row that is here, and it is giving me text and numbers in the same row, or in the same column, sorry. So I don't want that. So what I need to do is I'm going to filter out this row and this row, etc., down through my data set so that I've separated out my actual numeric values from my string values. All right, so in Alteryx Designer, how we would do that is we would come to our preparation palette and we would grab our filter tool and we would bring that down into our workflow. Now that we've added this here, now we're going to configure our filter. So to configure the filter, what we're going to do is we have to figure out from our data, what am I looking for, and what kind of filter do I want? So I'm going to click on, in my result window, I'm going to click on the input anchor, and here I see that what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same column as I did in my multi-row formula, and I'm going to say where the fund column is null, right? I don't want those rows as part of my data set. So in effect, I'm going to tell it I want to keep the values that are not where the fund column is not null. All right, so up here in my basic filter, I can click on the fund column, and then it gives you different options here. For our case, I want to come back here and I want to say is not null. So wherever the fund is not null, that's going to come out on the true. Let me zoom this in a little bit. That's going to come in on the zoom output anchor. Sorry, the true output anchor. If it is null, it's going to show up here on the false output anchor. All right, so let me run this. You can see we're down to 37 rows now. And when we look at our output, now those rows that had said taxable over here in this latest column are now gone. But we didn't lose our information because our information is still in our fund category column. So that looks good. Now, if you want to say, hey, what happened to those other rows? You can come over here to the false anchor, click on that, and what you'll see is that those rows came out on this anchor. Now, in our case, we're not going to do anything with those rows, but if you use a filter, remember that you can go from the true or the false output anchor. Either one will present the data that meets or fails that criteria. So in our case, if we didn't expect anything to fail that criteria, we might take a report from our false anchor and report it to someone to say, hey, there were some rows in our data set that didn't meet our criteria. And in our case, we expected this and we got rid of these. But in other cases, you might want to flag it and do some analysis later. All right, so now we have our columns. We have an additional fund category column, and I have my fund information here. Now, one of the things I want to point out at this point is from the very start, our columns were all string columns. Now, some people ask, well, why are they string columns if even if these are obviously numbers in here? Why were they coming in as string columns? Well, there's a couple of criteria that contributed to that. One is if we bring in a text file, like a CSV file, that is always going to come in as a string, even if the values are numeric. But the other thing to remember is if you look at our initial Excel file, when we brought this in, remember that in this one column here, even though that there were these numbers, there was also this YTD string in this particular column. So Alteryx is saying, hey, if any values in that column are strings, it's going to make that column a string data type so that it can fit and it can represent all the data that is shown in that column. Because if it made this a numeric column, it would have had to null out our YTD value here. But now that we've brought those up into the column headers and we have only numbers in here, now we can deal with the actual data types. So we could, remember from our select, we could go to each of our columns and make them numeric instead of strings. But I do want to show you that there is another tool within Alteryx that you can sometimes use to accomplish this. So if I grab my Autofilled tool and I bring that in onto my workflow, one of the things that I'll see here is this is a simple tool for configuration sake, because what you can see is that all it does is give you a list of all the columns. So in effect, what this tool does is it looks at all the data in your data set for that particular column, and it says, okay, what's the most efficient data type that can hold the information that's given me in this column. And so what it'll do is it'll change the data type to match what you have, what your data will support. So if we add this tool to the workflow and we run it, we will see that coming out of this thing here is we now see that we have doubles and for all our numeric columns, and our fund category is a string, and our fund column is a string, and our fund category column is also a string. So that's good. Now we have numeric columns and we have string columns. All right. Now we're getting pretty good here, but a couple of more things that we want to deal with. One is I don't like the idea of having fund category up here on the far right, and then right now I've got numbers, then I've got my funds, and I've got more numbers, then I've got my category over here. It would make more sense for me to have this category value all the way here on the left, followed by the fund column, and then the numeric columns after that. So if I want to reorder my columns, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here to the select tool. I'm going to bring that in here. And then on the select tool, there's a couple of ways to do this. For instance, if I grab my fund column here, if I highlight that fund column, I can just come up here to this arrow and I can move it to the up one, and that'll now make it to the left of the latest column. All right, so that's easy enough to do. Just highlight it and then click on the arrow of which way you want to move it. Now in the fund category, I could do the same thing. I could just click on the arrow until I get to the top. But that can be a little bit cumbersome sometimes, so I want to show you another way of doing that. With the fund category highlighted, I could come over here to options, I could go to move, and I can move the highlighted fields to the top. So I'm going to click that, and when I do that, now the fund category moved all the way to the top. So now when I run this, I'm going to have fund category and fund to the left of my data set. And now when I look at my data, I can see fund category, fund, and then my numbers. So now that's looking better. But there's actually one other thing that kind of bothers me, which is if I look in my columns, I can see that some of the values are null in my data set. Now, oftentimes when you're doing numeric analysis, you don't want to have nulls because nulls can throw off your formulas. So I want to introduce you to another tool that's available in Alteryx, which is the data cleansing tool. If I bring that in and I drop it into my workflow, then what I can do is I can say, hey, look at all my columns here, and this is the area I want to focus on for you right now is I can say I want to replace nulls. If it's a numeric field, it's going to replace the null with the 0. All right, so in my case, for my business rules, this is what I want. So I'm going to run this. Now when I look at my data, you can see that now that there is the number 0 where there used to be a null. And so my data is a lot cleaner looking that way. Now if I run formulas across multiple rows, I can do those formulas and I won't run into any problems with nulls that way. All right, so it's looking pretty good. I got my fund category, I got my fund, I've got all my numeric columns as numerics, and I've cleared off the nulls so that I've actually got numbers in each one of these columns. So that's pretty good. But now let's take one more step and step back, and let's look at our initial file again. Now, if I look at my initial file, if I come back up here to the top left, ranks as of August 11th, 2015. Well, you know what? This means that I probably am going to receive another one of these files maybe in a week, maybe daily. And so wouldn't it be important for me to know that these values for these funds are valid as of August 11th, 2015? So in our workflow, we don't want to lose that information about August 11, 2015. So we're going to go ahead and bring that into our data set. So going back to Alteryx, now where does that data exist? Because remember, at the start, I have that information, but the very first thing I'm doing is I'm getting rid of those 2 rows. So now that information is no longer in this part of my workflow. So I have to come all the way back to the beginning, and I'm going to create a second line of analysis. And so you can see here, one of the things I want to point out is when you bring in data, you can have multiple lines of analysis. You don't just have to have one line. You can have multiples. So in this case, I've got, I'm going to use my sample tool, and I only want that first row, right? Because so instead of saying skip a certain number of rows, I'm going to say I want the first 1 row. Now I'm going to put the browse tool at the end of that. All right. Now I'm going to show you another thing here. Since this part of the workflow is already pretty stable, I'm going to grab all of these here, and I'm going to then right click, and I'm going to put these in a container. That way I can organize it. And let's say some of this processing took some time. I could disable this container, and now I can just concentrate on my bottom line here. All right, so I'm going to run my query, and when I execute my workflow, if it's in a disabled container, it doesn't show up. It doesn't execute, so it doesn't take the time to process these tools that are in this disabled container. All right, so here I got the value that I'm looking for, and then I've got all these other columns. All right, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a lot of the tools we used already. I'm going to grab my select tool, because you know what? I don't need all of those. I don't need all of these columns. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say Option, Select. I'm going to deselect all the columns. Only column I really need is the first column. And I don't need it to be named fictional funds, fixed income funds. I'm going to rename this to be report date. All right, now I'm going to run it here. Now when I look at it, now I see that I've got this value here called ranks as of August 11, 2015. All right, well that's better, but I don't need the words ranks as of in my string here. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to use my formula tool. I'm going to bring that in here. Now in my formula tool, I'm going to say I'm going to select this column because I'm going to update this report date column. Then I'm going to use a built-in function that Alteryx has, which is called substring. So when I start typing in substring, it gives me the layout of it. What string am I going to get a substring of? That's my report date. So I'm going to grab report date here. So that's my, now the second part here is what character do I want to start at? All right, now that's one of the things we have to know. So in this case, I happen to know that if I put 12 in here, I'm going to get the right spot. Now, if I want the whole rest of my string, so I want the whole back side of my string, so I don't have to give it a length. So I'm going to delete that part. Now, when I do that, you'll see up in the data preview, it gives me August 11, 2015. So now when I run my query, I can see that now I have a report date of August 11th, 2015. Now that's really good, but let me show you one thing that gives me pause here, which is if I look at this report date, this is a string, right? A V string, so it's a variable string length report date. Well, that'll be good for my visual looking at this date, August 11, 2015. But what it doesn't help me with is, let's say I get one of these reports every week, and when I have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 different weeks, I might want to sort my data by date. Now, if my only date column was this string representation here, I would have a problem because it would try to sort it alphabetically. But I don't want it sorted alphabetically. I want to sort it by the actual month. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually create another column, and I'm going to make it an Alteryx date column. So what we're going to do then is that we're going to come up here to my parse tool. I'm going to grab my date time tool. I'm going to bring that into my workflow. Now that I've done this, I can see that it has 2 options. If I had a date and I wanted to make it a string, I could choose that option. But I actually do have a string and I want to make it a date. So that's what I'm going to use. It's going to say report date is my input. Now, what name do I want to give it? I'm going to call it an actual report date. All right, then here it gives you options for different formats, right? So if we look again at our input, we see that we have the month spelled out, August. All right, then it's a space, then the 2-digit day, then a comma, then the 4-digit year. Well, they have all these different options here, but I happen to know that I could come right down here to this one. So month spelled out is going to be month like August, space, 2-digit day, comma, 4-digit year. So if I highlight this one for this column, it will then create an additional column called actual report date. So when I do that, now you can see that I have this representation. Now in Alteryx, dates are always represented as the 4-digit year dash 2-digit month dash 2-digit day. All right, and just to verify, if I click here on metadata, you can see that my actual report date is of a data type date. So that way, if I need to do processing of multiple dates, I can have them in date order. I can sort them by date order as opposed to it trying to sort them by string values. All right, now this is good, but I want to I need to integrate these columns with my original analysis here, right? I want to actually be able to look over here and include my dates in my main report. So how do I do that? Well, last week we covered some of our blending tools, so I'm going to use one of those. I'm going to come back here to my join palette. I'm going to grab my Append Fields tool, and I'm going to drop it right here after my data cleansing tool. All right. Now it takes 2 inputs. So I've got my main data set here. Now I'm going to get rid of my browse tool, and I'm going to have this part connected in here. Now that I've done that, when I run my query again, you'll see here that now I have my date, I have my data in here. So now I'll know for each row that it belongs to the August 11th, 2015 file. Now I could go another step here if we wanted to. I could take another step and again, I could bring in a select tool and say, you know what, I want both of those. I want the report date and my actual report date. So I highlight them both, come up here to options, move those to the top. All right, then I'll run it again. And when I see here, I've got my report date, actual report date, and then my fund category fund and all my rest of my data. So now that's looking pretty good for me here. And now I've taken it from that initial file, right? That initial file where I had all these different pieces here to a final file which is ready for analysis. Now, if I go back to Alteryx, then if I wanted to, I could go back and output this. Instead of on the browse tool, I'm going to convert this to output data. I'm going to create this as an Excel file. So I'm going to create an Excel file. There it is. Excel file. I'm going to call this one webinar out. All right. Now I create the file. Now when it's going to be an Excel file, it's going to ask me what do I want to call this sheet. So I'm going to call this one fund analysis. And I hit OK. Now that I've done that, the error message goes away. And when I run this, I now get my output. And if I come down here to my result window, I actually get a link to the Excel file that I can open up. And I can see here that now I have all my data in nice clean columns and rows, numeric values and everything, and date values, just as I need to be able to do my analysis. All right, so that concludes the main part of our analysis today. Um, I want to make sure to see if we have any questions. I know that Andrew has been available to answer questions, but now that we're at the end here, did anybody have any questions that we can answer uh, before we're done for this session? All right. Now let me just finish up some nice things here while I'm waiting. And again, if you want to ask questions, you can put it in the Q&A and I'll address it immediately. Oh, I see something in the chat. All right. So it looks like we don't have any questions so far for today. So just to finish up, I would put this in another container here, right? And then I can say, I can name this container my report report date setup, right? And then up here, I can call this one my fund setup. So that way you can make it a little bit easier for somebody else who's coming in to look at your workflow. They can see the different flow of information, how you connect them back together, and the output that you have here. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And you can expect to receive a recording here pretty soon. Is there any way to see a summary of the steps? All right, so somebody's asking for a summary of the steps. Did you mean the steps of the whole workflow or the steps of a particular tool? Okay, of the whole workflow. Well, the only thing I could say to that right off the top is that we are going to send you a recording. So everything I did here, you'll be able to review by viewing the recording again. But also, if you'd like to contact our salespeople, they can you can ask them, and we can provide you a more detailed step by step on this as well, because this is one of the workflows that I use a lot in my training. Meaning in the tool itself. All right. Well, so the individual steps in the tool, if you read the recording, I'm sorry, if you watch the recording, I think that's the best way to handle it. I apologize if I'm not quite understanding your question. Feel free to email our team, and we can get back to you and answer that in more detail in a bit. All right. All right. Thank you, guys. And I will um, end our session here. And again, you should shortly be receiving a recording of this. And feel free to email our team if you have any further questions. All right. So uh, yeah, Andrew reminded me of something there that one of the things you can do if this helps with your question is if you click on the canvas area after you run your report, one of the things that you can do. Oh, let me change this a little bit. Append to existing. Alteryx doesn't like to open up or write to a file that's already opened up, so I'm getting rid of that there. If you run your workflow, one of the things is you'll get messages, and it'll give you messages about each of the different tools that ran that had any kind of thing. So you can follow along the individual tools this way as well. All right.